This video is very much for this particular historical moment in the United States during the summer of 2020. My hope is that in a few months it will be out of date and irrelevant. With that in mind, to anyone who might be watching this in the future, when this moment is long past and mostly forgotten, let me assure you that yes, we really were having a national debate over whether or not we should reopen schools during a pandemic. So, about that. We've been having this debate for several weeks now, but last week I began to feel a bit more optimistic about what the outcome would be, despite repeated demands and threats from President Trump and his Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who have been insisting all along that schools must be open for in-person instruction in the fall. The Board of Education in my rural, extremely Republican county voted unanimously not to send students and teachers back into schools, but instead to continue with full distance learning. And I thought, if we can figure it out, maybe everyone else will too. I started to feel like maybe this school thing would be okay. That feeling lasted like a day. While my local school board did the right thing, the safe thing for teachers and students and everyone else, other districts around the country have decided to do things differently, and some are still trying to figure out what to do. So I want to talk about some of the arguments people are making in favor of reopening schools. I'm making this video for the sake of the teachers in my life who I love, who I know are pissed off and scared and concerned for their students and themselves, for the parents I know and their children, and for my own peace of mind, so I can talk about this in a productive way instead of just sitting here worrying about the health and safety of people close to me, along with, the entire population of my country. There are many arguments being put forward for why we can, should, or must reopen schools for in-person instruction when the new school year starts in several weeks. I'm not going to cover every single argument I've encountered. I've narrowed it down to 10, but trust me, the arguments I left out aren't any better than the ones I'm about to discuss. There are no good arguments for reopening schools during a pandemic. Some are definitely more compelling than others. A few even merit serious consideration, but ultimately I have found none of them to be persuasive. The only way I can imagine thinking this was an acceptable idea is if I just didn't care about all the people who would get sick and die as a result. So, let's start there, because some of the most commonly heard arguments in favor of reopening schools are rooted in the belief that the pandemic just isn't that big of a deal. COVID-19 isn't as dangerous as they say. There's a 99% survival rate. It's no worse than the flu, and we don't close down schools for the flu. First, the survival rate isn't 99%. Second, the percentage of people who die after contracting the virus isn't the only thing we need to be worried about. Third, no matter how you look at it, it is worse than the flu. The 99% survival rate figure is misleading in a few ways. If we look at the number of deaths resulting from reported cases of COVID-19, the survival rate is closer to 97%. Dr. Anthony Fauci has estimated that the actual survival rate could be around 99% once we factor in unreported cases, and in fact, depending on how many unreported cases there are, and we don't know what that number is, the survival rate could be even higher than that. Maybe closer to 99.5%. The thing is, that number is not a universal constant, it's a result. 99% of people infected with COVID-19 don't survive because that's just the way it is. Many of those that develop serious symptoms wouldn't survive without treatment. If the numbers of people requiring treatment climb too high, our capacity to provide that treatment won't be able to meet the demand, and more people will die. Hospitals in many places with large numbers of COVID patients have already been pushed to their limits and beyond during the past several months. And thanks to belated and/or prematurely rescinded social distancing requirements, those numbers are climbing again throughout the country. But for the sake of argument, let's take that 99% survival rate as a given. Suppose we reopen schools, we find ourselves facing a worst-case scenario, and the infection spreads through all the schools all across the country. Would that really be so bad if 99% of those infected survive? According to the National Center for Education Statistics, there are about 57 million students attending public and private elementary, middle, and high schools in the United States. If every one of those students contracted COVID-19 and 99% of them survived, the 1% that didn't survive would consist of 570,000 students. But that's not all, because students aren't the only people in school. There are also about 3.7 million teachers working in public and private elementary, middle, and high schools. If 1% of them died, that amounts to 37,000 people. Hold on though, because we're still not done. We can't forget post-secondary schools, colleges, and universities. There are about 20 million students attending colleges and universities in the United States. 1% of that number is 200,000. And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are about 1.4 million teachers in post-secondary schools. 1% of them is 14,000. Add it all up, and we get 821,000 people. But of course, even that isn't a complete figure. Other people besides teachers and students work in school buildings: custodians, cafeteria workers, administrators. Plus, all of those people could potentially spread the infection to other people outside of the school. If we're going to look at what a 99% survival rate with universal infection looks like relative to schools, we might as well do the same for the entire country. The current population of the United States is approximately 330 million people. 1% of that is 3.3 million. Like I said, this is a worst-case scenario assuming universal infection. It would probably never get anywhere near that bad. Although, I've thought that before over the past 4 years and been proven breathtakingly wrong, so weigh that prediction accordingly. But that's not the point. The point is, if you're saying, well, 99% of the people who get it survive, as a reason to open schools before the COVID-19 pandemic is under control, or to downplay the threat of the outbreak in general, you should know how many people you're saying you're okay with sacrificing. As for the "it's no worse than the flu" bit, according to the Centers for Disease Control, last year, around 34,000 people in the United States died due to the seasonal flu. To date, there have been over 140,000 COVID-related deaths reported in the United States, and as I record this, we're not even through July yet. One last thing, we do close down schools for the flu, actually. 2 years ago, we had an unusually nasty flu season. The CDC estimates 61,000 people died during that season. Still less than half the number of COVID-related deaths so far this year, but a horrible statistic nonetheless. According to education news site The 74, schools in 12 states, including at least 11 entire school districts, were shut down for a day or longer due to the severity of that year's flu outbreak. Kids don't get sick from COVID. While it's true that severe symptoms and life-threatening complications seem to be less common in children, it is not true that kids just don't get it. Children can develop COVID-19, and children with certain underlying health conditions are at greater risk of developing serious complications. One of those complications, multi-symptom inflammatory syndrome in children, or MIS-C, can be deadly. Besides that, children can still be carriers of the disease. Even if they are at lower risk of getting seriously ill or dying themselves, they can spread the disease to others, which means it's important for the health and safety of everyone that we continue to try and limit children's exposure. Schools in other countries are opening. That's nice. How's that relevant? Of all the arguments I hear people making, particularly on television from the White House, this one annoys me the most, because in order to take it seriously, you have to assume that our response to the COVID-19 outbreak in the U.S. has been sufficient and that the pandemic is now under control. And that is not even close to the truth. Months into the pandemic, things are actually getting worse in many areas, not better. Our belated, half-assed response to the outbreak has meant that not only are we still struggling to contain COVID while many other countries have been able to begin gradually transitioning back to something resembling normal, but we also have more total COVID-related deaths than any other country, and according to an analysis by Johns Hopkins University, the second highest number of deaths per 100,000 people. A couple of weeks ago, Trump tweeted, quote, "In Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and many other countries, schools are open with no problems." Here, again courtesy of Johns Hopkins University, is a graph of daily COVID-19 cases in Germany over the past several months. See how the number of cases peaked in late March, early April, and have been steadily declining ever since? Here's our graph. See how the number of cases is still continuing to increase? Germany, us. Germany, us. And by the way, states, including my state of Maryland, began closing down public schools on March 12, which is right there. Now we're here, and we're arguing over whether or not it's safe for schools to reopen. Some of the other arguments in favor of reopening sidestep the threat posed by COVID-19 altogether and focus on the well-being of children. For example, distance learning is inferior to in-person instruction, privileges kids from wealthier families and school districts, and disadvantages students with special needs. There's also this one. Keeping kids out of school slows their social development and can be harmful to their mental health. Also, for some children who are abused or neglected at home, school is their only safe space. And keeping kids home overburdens working parents who rely on schools to provide childcare so they can work during the day. I'm grouping these arguments together and answering them all at once because my response to each one of them is the same. They're right. In-person instruction is better than distance learning. Going to online-only education does disadvantage kids from poor communities who often don't have reliable access to the technology necessary for effective distance learning. It is better for the social development and emotional well-being of most kids to be in school. And it is unfortunately true that some kids are abused or neglected at home, and school is their only escape. For far too many kids, school is also the only place where they can count on getting a good meal. All of those things are true. All of those things are excellent reasons why, generally speaking, kids belong in school under normal circumstances. But these are not normal circumstances. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. Sending kids to school now endangers them, their teachers, and other adults who work at their schools and the rest of their families. You don't have to convince me that sending students to school is better than distance learning for a million different reasons. I agree with you. So does every teacher I've talked to about this. But the positives of sending kids back to school under the present circumstances do not outweigh the negatives of continuing to exacerbate this pandemic. As for the overburdening of working parents, I agree with that point too. It's not fair that many working parents have to rely on schools to provide childcare in order for them to go to work to keep a roof over their heads. It's actually one of the main reasons why I oppose reopening the economy so soon, and why I support additional and more generous stimulus payments from the government and things like canceling rent and pausing mortgage payments and utility bills and insurance premiums for the duration of the pandemic, so that workers can afford to stay home and businesses can afford to stay closed until it's actually safe to open things up again. I sympathize with working parents who need someone to look after their children, but it seems to me the solution to that problem, in the short term anyway, is to demand that our taxes be used to pay for the assistance they need to take care of themselves and their children safely, rather than sending their children into a situation that could endanger everyone. In the long term, I think measures like a permanent form of universal basic income, government-subsidized childcare, and making food, water, and housing human rights rather than something you have to trade your labor for would be a big help in dealing with this problem in the future if there's another pandemic and we botch our response to that one as badly as we have this one. Speaking of long-term changes, I hope everyone, especially high-ranking government officials, but everyone, who has suddenly become aware of the injustice of economic inequality, particularly how it affects education, will remember that when this pandemic is finally over. Because all those kids from low-income communities who are disadvantaged by distance learning, they're disadvantaged all the time in all sorts of ways. And it's wrong, and there's no excuse for it, public health crisis or not. The same goes for everyone who has recently found themselves championing the causes of students with special needs, children who live with food insecurity, or who suffer from abuse or neglect at home. Simply sending them to school doesn't solve the problems they face. And when it is safe for them to go back into their classrooms, they're still going to need your help. Don't forget about them when you no longer need them to justify your policies. Colleges and universities can't afford to stay closed. This reminds me of the broader argument for reopening the economy during the pandemic and elicits for me the same question in response. Won't it be just as bad, if not worse, in the long run if you reopen before it's safe and are forced to shut down again because so many people are getting sick? I get that colleges and universities, and private K-12 schools for that matter, are in a tough spot. Some schools that have closed their campuses, like Harvard, are continuing to charge full tuition for distance learning. Students who had planned to attend those schools might decide it's not worth the money if they can't even go to the actual school and opt not to take any classes this term. Other schools that have moved to distance learning have reduced their tuition accordingly. Either way, schools stand to lose a lot of money by remaining closed. And while institutions like Harvard, with massive endowments and mailing lists packed with wealthy alumni, will be fine, smaller, less wealthy schools might not be. It would be a shame to see good schools be forced to close on a more permanent basis because they couldn't afford to hang on through a pandemic-related shutdown. But I don't think the answer to that problem lies in reopening campuses and exposing students and faculty to the risk of infection, illness, and possibly death. The answer, once again, is to demand that our government, which is operated by elected representatives who are ultimately accountable to us, do what we need it to do in this time of crisis. The choices here aren't send students and teachers back to school and hope too many don't die, or keep universities closed and hope they don't run out of money. If Congress can afford to give millions of dollars in loans to Trump's lawyers and car dealerships owned by members of Congress under the guise of COVID-19 relief funds, then it can afford to give struggling colleges and universities the funds they need to stay afloat until it's safe to allow people back on campus. Other essential workers have been working all through this pandemic. Why are teachers putting up such a fight to avoid it? Teachers aren't fighting to avoid having to do their jobs. They're fighting for the ability to do their jobs in a way that is safe for their students and themselves. Just because schools closed throughout most of the country in March, that doesn't mean teachers have been enjoying an extra long summer vacation. Lots of teachers work second jobs during their summer vacation anyway, but that's beside the point. When schools closed and shifted to distance learning, teachers continued to do their jobs. In fact, they found themselves doing their jobs in a way many of them hadn't prepared for, that presented a plethora of unique challenges and brought with it new sources of stress, and they made it work because that's what teachers do. They do more than should be possible with less than they deserve. And if it sounds like I'm glorifying teachers, you're damn right I am. I know there are bad teachers, just like there are bad people in every other line of work, but generally speaking, teachers do more with less than any other profession in our society. We require them to spend years of their lives getting a challenging and very expensive education. We pay them peanuts compared to other professions with comparable educational requirements. We hobble and vilify their labor unions, and when kids fail to thrive due to poverty or special needs or a horrible home life, we blame the teachers instead of the politicians who make it so needlessly difficult for teachers to do what we demand of them. It's true, other essential workers have been working this whole time. So have teachers. How many of those other essential workers have been forced to work in a closed environment where social distancing is next to impossible without adequate protective equipment, having to add COVID-related precautions to a job so packed with responsibilities that many of them barely had time to do it all before? And when you've heard stories of other essential workers forced to work in such environments, has your reaction been, hey, too bad, they should just take their chances? Or has it been, that's unacceptable, no one should be forced to do that, somebody should do something? Workers in any job, no matter how essential it is to the functioning of society, have the right to demand the safest work environment possible for them and for anyone affected by what they do. And we, as members of the society that benefits from their work, have the responsibility to provide it for them as far as we are able. You want teachers to do their jobs? Teachers want to do their jobs too. Many teachers will do their jobs even if they're forced to do them in an environment that isn't safe, and they will protect their students at the risk of their own health if necessary, because those are the kinds of people who become teachers in the first place. The problem here isn't what teachers are willing to do. The problem is what we are asking of them. Instead of demanding that they risk their health and the health of their students, we should be giving them the support they need to do their jobs as effectively and as safely as possible. And we shouldn't stop giving them that support when the pandemic is over. Keeping schools closed is a political ploy. This is an argument that Trump and his supporters have been pushing for weeks. The Democrats want to keep the schools closed so it'll make Trump look bad going into the election. Let's get real here. No matter what happens with schools and the COVID pandemic between now and the election, it's going to make Trump look bad, because Trump's response to the pandemic these past 6 months has been a tale of indifference, gross incompetence, and sociopathic self-interest. The fact that COVID-19 is still enough of a threat to require that schools remain closed is in large measure Trump's fault, and the fault of the state governors and legislators who have followed his lead. So, yeah, the schools being closed is going to make him look bad. The Democrats aren't to blame for that. And come on, if the Democrats were only worried about politics here, would they even be putting up a fight? If they wanted to make Trump look bad, they'd stand aside and allow him and his allies to force schools to reopen in the middle of a pandemic. I'm pretty sure thousands of children all across the country getting sick and dying due to the president's ignorant insistence that they go back to school would make him look worse than keeping schools closed for safety's sake. If Democrats or anybody are fighting to keep schools closed this fall, it's not because they want to make Trump look bad. It's because, unlike Trump, they care about who lives and who dies. Things have to get back to normal eventually. Here's the problem, though. Things aren't normal. And if we try to force it by acting like everything is normal, things won't actually be normal again for a long time. If we all could have just kept it together, done a proper shutdown for a couple of months, and agreed to wear masks when we went out for a couple of months after that, we'd probably be through the worst of this by now, and maybe reopening schools with appropriate precautions in place would be a reasonable thing to suggest. But that's not what happened. We kinda sorta shut down for a few weeks. Then the President of the United States started going on TV and talking about how it was time to start opening things back up again. And then a bunch of us decided for ourselves, on the basis of absolutely nothing but our own unfounded intuition, that it had been long enough and we should just start going out again. I mean, it's summer, right? Let's hit the beach. What's the harm? Normal means the pandemic is over, or at least tightly contained. Normal means our graph of daily cases looks more like this than like this. Normal means, yeah, bars can reopen, restaurants can allow people to dine in again, kids can go back to school. And other countries who were hit hard by the pandemic are nearly there, or at least a lot closer than we are. But here in the United States, we aren't there yet. In many ways, we're even further from normal than we were when we first shut everything down. That's because we didn't do what was necessary to get back to normal. And the worst part is, with cases and deaths continuing to pile up, many of us continue to resist doing that work. Even now, people are still rebelling against mask requirements, still making a virtue of defying the recommendations of public health officials, and still pushing for all of us to just pretend that this isn't happening, even if it means endangering the health and lives of children, their teachers, and everyone else who comes into contact with them. No, opening schools during a pandemic is not a good idea. Not if you want to control the pandemic, and not if you care about the people in those schools.